Discover the untold story of college hookup culture with American Hookup by Lisa Wade. This insightful and engaging audiobook explores the complexities of modern relationships on campus.
That was ideal, agreed another, who said that women generally look for a guy that we don't actually really like his personality, but we think is really attractive and hot and good in bed. It's not difficult to imagine where students get the idea that it's acceptable, even desirable, to have sex with people that they find socially unbearable or morally repugnant. A quick tour of our insult vocabulary reveals that the cultural association of hate and sex is pervasive in language. We use the word fuck, after all, both to describe having sex and to deliver one of our nastiest insults, alongside a range of other invectives. We also use sexual body parts as slurs. Scumbag is a word that originally meant condom and other sperm receptacles, such as people with vaginas and men who receive anal sex. The variations on "you suck," like cocksucker, work as an insult by positioning the male or female receiver in the position of sexually servicing a man. We even put the words hate and fuck together in the term hate fuck, a phrase that refers to having sex with a person you despise. Pornographers quite clearly think that hatred and violence are hot, and no generation in recent history has had more exposure to or been more approving of pornography. Physical aggression and insults are routine in the most mainstream material, as are obvious signs of pain and distress on the part of actresses. In porn, being called a cunt and gagging on a roughly thrust penis turns women on, and men are told in no uncertain terms that they should get off on the same. And that's the tame stuff. One doesn't have to look into the nether regions of the internet to find this message. In pop culture, the hottest sex is often between two people who hate each other. Dozens of TV shows and movies each year include a plotline involving a conceited, but fantastically beautiful, woman and an obnoxious, but painfully attractive, man who detest each other but end up having sex, usually thanks to a particularly heated argument. They rip off each other's clothes, throw each other against the wall, and knock over lamps. Turned on to the point of violence, they go straight to intercourse. They are fight fucking, a Hollywood phenomenon in which two people who hate each other are also inexplicably attracted to one another, causing them to transition from fighting to fucking in an instant. Desire that can overcome true loathing must be powerful indeed. Any young person growing up today with exposure to routine media content can easily come away with the notion that hate and lust are good bedfellows. Predictably, then, the idea bubbled up in my students' journals. From time to time, it was certainly part of how a girl named Sydney thought about a guy named Brad. When I first started hooking up with him, she wrote, I absolutely hated him. I thought he was weird and annoying and ugly, and I wanted nothing to do with him. They hooked up repeatedly, over 10 times in fact. Still, she insisted, he continued to mean nothing to me. Brad wasn't the only guy to get this treatment. She preferred callousness to caring. You only pursue the people you know mean nothing to you, and you never stick around long enough to let them. You stay clearly on the easy side of the line. One night she found herself nestled up against the guy who meant nothing to her on his twin mattress. They had left a party together at about 3 a.m., surprised to discover that the weather had turned to what passes for winter in the south, mildly cold and a bit drizzly, and hurried back to his dorm, shivering, and jumped into bed. As the rain dribbled down the window pane, Brad moved to have intercourse. Sydney stopped him. She'd gone off the pill over winter break and explained to Brad that sex without a condom was no longer possible. Brad wasn't in the habit of treating his sexual partners nicely either, and Because he wanted to do it anyway, he pressured her to go ahead, insisting that he'd pull out. When she told him no, he called her a bitch for leading him on. Sydney's bravado withered under his cruelty. She pleaded with him, promising that she'd get a condom the next day and that they could have sex then. He responded with threats. He said he wouldn't call me tomorrow night unless I had sex with him tonight, Sydney recalled, describing the conversation. I tried to explain to him that I was really scared of getting pregnant and that he was being unreasonable. He told me that if I didn't have sex with him right now, I was welcome to get out of his bed, walk back to my dorm in the cold, and never hear from him again. So, Sydney complied. They had sex. He pulled out and passed out. She spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, terrified of getting pregnant, imagining how she would tell her parents, wondering if she could tell Brad, and worrying about the logistics and expense of an abortion. At dawn, she got up and left him sleeping. She walked home on that damp morning, alone in the cold after all. And, she reported with a sad sense of irony, as it turns out, he didn't call me the next night. Or any night. There's likely more than one reason why Sydney complied when Brad was cruel, but partly it's that she had no expectation that her partner would be kind to her. In hookup culture, it isn't a partner's job to be nice. Sydney had no recourse, because calling someone a bitch is technically allowed. And she knew it. All of this, the ban on warmth, the imperative to be cool, and the permission to be cold, is really hard on students. They are just human beings, ones who can be super chill, of course, but not all the time and not in the face of just anything. Suppressing their instinct to be kind and their sense of entitlement to the same was jarring and exhausting. One of my students called it emotionally shredding. Most were open to love, but they would have been satisfied if their hookup partners were simply respectful. I would love to have meaningful sex with people I respect, sighed one student hopelessly. Students just wanted something, anything positive to come out of their hookups. I think it could be like, you make me feel optimistic, or you make me feel alive, or you make me feel safe, wrote one. Or you inspire me. Another clarified, love is not as important as trust. Trust may, indeed, be having a lull. Young people today are significantly more likely than the 2 generations before them to agree that people are just looking out for themselves. A full 60% of millennials and 62% of college students say so, compared to less than half of Generation X and just over a third of the Boomer generation. There is an inherent lack of trust in everyone and everything, wrote a female student. Like most girls I want to hook up with, explained a male student about a prospect, I don't trust her. Hookups lead to trust issues, said 3 students separately. Young people today are more cynical, in general, and they're more cynical about love in particular. In The End of Men, Hannah Rosen calls freedom from love relationships feminist progress, and lots of students are inclined to agree, but my students would have liked a little compassion alongside their liberation. They want fun and freedom, and women don't want to go back to a world where being sexually active marks them as disreputable by definition, but they also want to be treated with basic courtesy and to have kind and generous sexual exchanges with others. What I really want right now, one side, is for someone to be nice to me and just want me in that way. Men wanted this, too. Students wanted to hook up with someone who they knew felt goodwill toward them and would be courteous to them, treating them at least as well as they treat total strangers. It didn't often happen. But at least the sex is hot, right? Unequal pleasures. As Celeste's first year of college was coming to a close, her enthusiasm for hooking up was waning. She had hooked up with 12 men, proceeding to intercourse with 5 of them, and not a single one had given her an orgasm. "A girl's got needs, too," she complained, writing that she had started to feel like little more than a piece of ass used to satisfy the male hookup fantasy. She'd learned to expect nothing from men. "The guy kind of expects to get off," she wrote, "while the girl doesn't expect anything." Her resentment built and, after one especially upsetting night, she wrote, angrily, "I am not a masturbation toy." To be fair, Celeste was having particularly bad luck, but she isn't wrong to think that women are getting shorted in hookup culture. Women in college, like American women more generally, have fewer orgasms than their male counterparts. The numbers vary, but, in general, women have 1 or 2 orgasms for every 3 that men enjoy. The data on college students reflect this pattern. The online college social life survey results show that in hookups men are more than twice as likely as women to have an orgasm. Myths about men's and women's bodies suggest that this gap is a biological inevitability. Men's orgasms are easy to elicit, we are told. If anything, they arrive too effortlessly. The female orgasm, in contrast, is portrayed as finicky. If women don't have orgasms, the narrative suggests it's because the clitoris is hard to find and difficult to operate. Even when conditions are ideal, an orgasm often fails to show. It's a mystery, we shrug. We tell ourselves that women are physiologically different, not as sexual as men, and so we presume that release is less important to them. Anyway, today's college students generally buy into these ideas. When sociologist Jess Butler asked students at the University of Southern California what accounted for gender differences in rates of orgasm, by far, she said, the most common explanation was it's biological. Her students believed that orgasm was harder for women and takes longer, but just happens for men. Given this sense of the nature of things, she said, her students were unfazed by statistics demonstrating that men were getting off more often than women. The idea that the orgasm gap is natural, though, is wrong. Some countries, such as the United States and Russia, have up to twice as large a gap as others, such as Brazil and Japan. Among Americans, lesbian women report 2 to 3 times as many orgasms as heterosexual ones, as many, in fact, as heterosexual men. In masturbation, orgasms come easily and quickly to both sexes. On average, each requires just 4 efficient minutes to reach climax. Even women who never have orgasms with male partners often do regularly when they're alone. The orgasm gap is not a biological fact, it's a social one, which reflects what people choose to do in bed together. Among college students, for example, the likelihood of a woman having an orgasm in a hookup with a man varies from 15 to 63%, depending on whether he performs oral sex, they engage in intercourse, she self-stimulates, or they do some combination of those things. In relationships, if couples engage in all 3 activities, women's likelihood of having an orgasm is 92%. Not so finicky, it turns out. If hookup culture has an orgasm gap, and it does, then the question isn't what might be wrong with women's bodies, but the extent to which the female orgasm is made a priority. What we should be asking is whether men and women care enough about female orgasm to give it the OL college try. One day in her journal, Ashlyn recalled a side-splitting morning recap with her friend, Izzy. The night before, Izzy had performed fellatio during a hookup and was pleasantly surprised when her partner moved to return the favor. But he licked her, Ashlyn reported, just once. She looked at Izzy. A single lick, she asked incredulously. We laughed until our stomachs were sore. They found it hilarious, but obnoxious, too. His short attention span indicates something more than laziness, Ashlyn insisted, trying to imagine what it would look like for a girl to go down on a guy and lick his penis just once. It was inconceivable. The fellatio. Cunnilingus double standard really irks me, she wrote. It wasn't always this way. For most of European American history, oral sex of any kind was considered perverse and was forbidden alongside homosexual sex and masturbation. American marriage experts only started recommending it in the early 1900s. It was a response to the emergence of the home as a respite from capitalism and a place for care, a shift that newly required that spouses be lovers as well as life partners. Marriage, in other words, was eroticized. Husbands had a new responsibility for a novel idea, making sex pleasant for their wives. Since women had been recast as pure, this was believed to be a somewhat arduous task. The early sex educator Margaret Sanger, for example, likened women to stone. In her 1926 relationship advice manual, Happiness in Marriage, she explained that a husband's job is to bring to life the real woman of flesh and blood concealed in the statue he adores. Elaborating, she wrote, his first duty is the preparation of the hidden, deepest nature of his beloved to receive his love. In opening the portals of her being, or better still, in persuading the woman to open these secret portals and to receive him, the young husband deepens and intensifies tenfold the love nature of his partner. To do so, she said, he should use all the resources he has at his command. Cunnilingus was the trick. The endorsement of oral sex for women would ease the way for fellatio, as experts noticed what wives had known all along, that women's bodies weren't the only ones that could sometimes use a little help. A flagging erection got the prescription of a genital kiss, though in either case marriage experts were clear that oral sex was only to be used to facilitate coitus, not as its substitute. With that, fellatio and cunnilingus became a team, fighting the good fight for happy marriages everywhere. And then, things changed. Now oral sex is common among sexually active people, but, as Ashlyn rightly observed, there's a double standard. Teens of both sexes agree that cunnilingus is a bigger deal than fellatio. Reflecting this, the majority of sexually active 16 to 18-year-old girls have performed oral sex on boys, seeing it as routine, but boys do not do the same for girls. Only 6% say they're in favor of the practice, though some, sounding a bit like Victorian husbands, say they will do it to gain access to intercourse. As a result, among young people, fellatio occurs much more frequently than cunnilingus. It's true in hookups, too. When guy-girl hookups proceed to oral sex, the most common scenario is for men and women to give it to each other. But if the oral sex only goes one way, it goes the guy's way more than 2/3 of the time. In that 2/3, when oral sex occurs, the women aren't getting a lick of it. And if Izzy's story is any indication, this data overstates the balance between fellatio and cunnilingus, because asking whether oral sex occurred doesn't tell us how much time and effort was put into each activity, or whether it persisted to orgasm. We do know that when students receive oral sex in a hookup, men are almost twice as likely as women to have an orgasm. The orgasm gap, in other words, is no smaller even when oral sex is involved. Likely, these numbers reflect women's greater commitment to getting men off, but also the fact that men use oral sex like Victorian husbands did once and teenage boys do now, as a precursor to another sexual activity that favors male orgasm, intercourse. "The vaginas are coming," said the signs popping up around campus. They signaled the impending annual performance of the now classic college theater event, the Vagina Monologues, and students involved with the production were piling on the publicity, getting creative with ways to draw attention and make their peers squirm. On the walls of the campus game room and snack bar, they had hung posters of female student volunteers holding a whiteboard that read, "Let my vagina dash dash dash." Consistent with the theme of letting individual vaginas do the talking. Students filled out the end however they wished and posed to be photographed. As Ashlyn slid into a wooden booth with her biology textbook, an uncomfortable snicker came from the display. Curious after Izzy's single lick story, she opened her book but kept an eye on the people walking by. In her own experience, people seemed to think that the vulva was, at least, a little bit gross and, while sex was a near constant topic of conversation, whenever anyone brought up cunnilingus, it got brushed off or laughed off. Talking about it crossed some invisible line, Ashlyn guessed, between sexy and not-so-sexy sexual topics. As she suspected, people walking past the display would sometimes laugh and grimace. A guy guffawed at one that read, "Let my vagina froth." He twisted his face into a grimace, pointed at it, and said, "That's disgusting." This elicited laughter from the girl at his side. A bit later, Ashlyn wrote, "I saw a male friend pass one that read, 'Let my vagina flow.' He said, 'EW, that's pretty gross,' to his companion. When a guy and a girl eyed one that read, 'Let my vagina pulsate,' they began to laugh hard. 'Gross,' he said. The girl shook her head. 4 of Ashlyn's friends joined her at the table just as a group of Vagina Monologues promoters wandered in to hand out cookies frosted to look like vulvas. When the cookies came around, Ashlyn wrote, "All 4 people I was sitting with immediately averted their eyes. No one touched them." She got the distinct sense that her friends thought the cookies were obscene. Had they been in the shape of penises, she thought, her friends would have happily eaten them, even mimicking blow-jobs for a chuckle. There was something light-hearted about the penis, she'd noticed, but not the vulva, not at all. In fact, many of my female students, and especially the heterosexual ones, had internalized a general disgust toward their genitals. Comments like the ones observed by Ashlyn exacerbated their insecurity. Women overheard men saying that vaginas were dirty and that women who squirt are disgusting. One woman's friend announced that he would never go down on a girl unless she was completely shaven and I saw her clean her vagina out. Another girl sat at dinner with a guy who complained that their Vietnamese spring roll appetizer tasted like cooter. All of this was pretty hard for women to disregard, even if most men didn't feel the same. For some lucky women, fantastic experiences with men who enjoyed performing oral sex turned the tide. "It really impresses most girls," boasted one cunnilingus-loving guy, but most women remained ambivalent, at best, about whether it was a good idea to let a guy go down on them. Even women who believed that the negative characterization of female genitals was unfair had a hard time shaking off their worries. "I tend to be more self-conscious about the way I taste or smell," wrote one. "Even though I know I'm very clean and it's really his problem if he doesn't like it." Izzy felt the same. "I think the act that has been the most touchy for me is cunnilingus, because it's considered to be so intimate and possibly unpleasant for the person doing it." She discussed overhearing people saying, "Oh, it's smelly down there, it tastes bad, it takes forever." The single lick incident didn't help. Likewise, sexually audacious Celeste, despite being experienced and adventurous, wasn't immune to these comments. Only one of the 12 guys she had hooked up with had Performed oral sex, and this was maddening, but it was a relief, too. Using the term most common among my students, she admitted that many girls are a little uncomfortable and insecure about being eaten out, including myself. We women are afraid of being judged and talked about as being smelly or whatever. Interested in women's discomfort with cunnilingus, sociologist Laura Backstrom and her colleagues interviewed women at Stanford and Indiana University about their thoughts on receiving oral sex. Just over a quarter of the women had strongly negative views of the practice, using words like weird, bizarre, dirty, and nasty to describe it. The rest had positive feelings about cunnilingus, but only a few felt comfortable asking for it. For men, especially in hookups, some expressed the familiar idea that cunnilingus is somehow a bigger deal than fellatio. It feels like a guy going down on you is a bigger step than you going down on a guy, said one, which is probably unfair. I think I felt kind of guilty almost, said another woman of the men she hooked up with, like I felt like I was kind of subjecting people to something they didn't want to do, and I felt bad about it. Women seem convinced that men don't like it.